Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it is week 4. Here we are with Newsshooter Weekly, and I am happy to be here on a Thursday as opposed to our normal time of Wednesday, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. And you will notice that we have a different 3 up here in the show, and that is because we have a special guest, and Erik Naso is running just a little bit behind. He's going to join us in a little while. So welcome, gentlemen, to another episode of Newsshooter Weekly. How are you?
We're good.
Great. Thanks for having me.
This gentleman in the middle rectangle is Dave May, and he is based out of Australia, and he is a cinematographer, documentary filmmaker. He has a production company based there, and as most of you know who are joining us on the show, a little camera that could was announced today by Canon on their new Canon Vision platform in Europe. What is that? Central Europe summertime at 2 p.m. And a long article has been posted by Matt Allard on that camera. And Dave is one of the few people on this planet who has actually shot with the camera. Dave, if you wouldn't mind giving us a little introduction to who you are, that would be awesome. And then we can really just dedicate this hour talking about this camera and your experience with it and all of that kind of stuff. Is that cool?
Sounds great. First though, thanks so much for having me. And I'm sure a few people have probably said it, but huge fan of Newsshooter. Been reading you guys for years, and so it's really it's great to get on here and get the chance to have a chat with you. It's just sad that Erik decided that it wasn't worth it. I basically shoot a lot of documentary stuff here in Australia. I work for predominantly our public broadcasters, so sort of our version of the BBC, the ABC. For Australian audiences, I've worked on shows like You Can't Ask That, Employable Me. These are we call them factual television. They're sort of like observational documentaries that you film over a few months. They're kind of a little, almost reality TV, but usually with a bit of a social point to them. I also run a small business and, shoot music videos and that kind of thing. So I've always used Canon cameras primarily, and over the last couple of years started talking with the guys here about cameras like the C500 Mark II and recently the C300 Mark III. So it's been great. They kind of fit what I'm doing, both in the TV stuff that I shoot, but also in that production company side of things. So when the C70 was kind of announced, first rumored, they got me in to have a look at it because they knew it kind of fit within the C500 Mark II, C300 Mark III work I'm doing, but also that it's got particular strengths that, if you were using it not as a B camera, you were using it as an A camera, there's a lot to like about it there as well. So yeah, that's kind of how I've ended up here.
Awesome. Matt, for people who don't know who you are, but if they follow Newsshooter, they absolutely do. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'm a freelance DP based out of Tokyo, Japan. I've been here for almost getting up close to 7 years now. So I mainly specialize in documentaries, corporate work, but I dabble in a bunch of other things. And I'm the editor of Newsshooter, and I've been involved with Newsshooter for 10 years now, I think. So, yep, that's me.
So we're going to try something here, which is we're going to go to the 4-up. And there he is. It's amazing. It actually worked. And he was in the green room. He had his is it called a rider? What's it called when you're like a rock star and you have your rider? He had his rider. He had to finish. Yeah, he had to finish his crystal and everything else. And he's all good.
I have to be fashionably late and stress everybody out. That's your typical rock star, right? Show up kind of when you want to and maybe leave a little early. I don't know. Hi, guys. It's great to be here. Thank you so much, Dave, for being here and doing the C70 release. This is exciting. This is huge. This is momentous for Canon, right? Because I think this is a mashup camera that I think everybody wanted. Of course, it doesn't have everything you want because you're not going to get that in any camera. But it is an exciting release, and I cannot wait to hear more about the hands-on aspect of the camera on this really cool stream. And I'm glad to be here.
And
Eric, before we
and
go any further, my friend James, who actually was the colorist on this piece, he wanted to say that you're a legend and he thanks you very much. So there you go.
Well, thank you. I don't even know what to say. Maybe I should just grab my crystal and walk away and go out on a highway, right?
and your
Don't
and
give
your
him
braised
those.
kale
Don't
salad.
talk him up, Dave. Don't talk him up. We'll have to get him a bigger trailer.
Sorry.
Yeah, look his head is getting bigger and bigger with his braised kale salad. Okay, so just watch yourself, kids. Look, we had I think what we can consider a pretty big announcement today, and you know we all have a history with digital cinema cameras. We've all been around the block for a long time. I think that you know this whole thing could arguably be said to have started with the 5D Mark II, but really when the AF100 came out from Panasonic, we started to see cameras in these strange form factors with larger than 1/3 to 2/3 inch sensors. And, you know, there's a lot of favorite cameras of all time, but I would say that the C100 Mark I and the Mark II became pretty big workhorses, followed up, really in between those two cameras with the C300, and that sort of became the darling of documentary filmmakers. And then we've had a lot of evolution since then. You know, we've had our FS 100s and 700s, we've had our, you know, FS 7s and our C300 Mark IIs. And then we've kind of had this, I don't know what you would call it, but this whole rebirth of the small format camera with the mirrorless world, which I would kind of argue really started with the A7 series with Sony, and we have, you know, the GH4 from Panasonic. But this is kind of a unique camera because we really have something that looks like it's a medium format camera in some ways in terms of the size. We definitely are borrowing from and taking from much higher end cameras in the market, and obviously the most obvious, I'll say obvious again, is the C300 Mark III. And Dave, you have had a lot of hands-on with this camera, and really I think what both you know, myself and Matt, and then also talking to Eric, we wanted to do was really make this hour about your experience with the camera, allow people to ask questions in the chat. We have a new update in Ecamm Live, which we're using, so you can see the questions as well, though I can field them in the chat live. And I think, you know, what we want to do is just find out more about your experience with using this camera as somebody who also owns a C300 Mark III, who owns a C500 Mark II. So you have a lot of perspective in terms of where this camera fits and slots in to production. And it's not like you're just a Canon fanboy and it's the only camera that you shoot on. You have experience shooting on other digital cinema cameras. So I don't know where we want to start here. I kind of feel like the best way to get into this is to watch a BTS of something that you've shot that is a project that is up on Newsshooter's site. And by the way, if you're interested in the in-depth article, check out newsshooter.com. It's the top article right now on the website. If you're interested in the camera, support the site. It doesn't cost you any more. There's an affiliate link here below the fold, and you can check stuff out on the article. And I think we'll just go ahead and play this 3.5 to 4 minute piece. We're just going to mute our audio and let it play, and then we're going to come back up and we're going to start asking you questions. Is that cool, everybody? Should we do it?
Let's do
Let's
it.
roll that tape.
Let's do it. Okay, everybody is going to get muted except for the movie we're going to play.
My name is Kate Cornish. I am the Director of Photography today. We are shooting a live music performance for Kim Churchill on the new Canon C70.
I'm leaving here. I sell off for my days.
The fact that the camera is so small and it has all of the features that you would expect in a larger camera, like built-in NDs, I think is incredible. I like shooting handheld because it puts the audience in the space with the artist. Like, are you catching me in here? This is as close as I'll probably get. We're going to go handheld for the majority of the clip, but we will shoot on a gimbal for the opening shot. I'll come on Dave's camera left, you're on camera right, cross-shooting that.
We wanted to film the video in a way that kind of fit the environment that we're in. I think the handheld coverage and the kind of organic way that we're going to move the camera is going to really help reflect Kim's live performance.
Oh my God.
Who summoned the ugliest sounding bird?
When I first did my test with the camera, just straight off the bat, I thought that the image quality was amazing. The DGO-enabled sensor gives us 16 plus stops of dynamic range. I could still see a lot of details in the shadows. We're choosing to shoot at the last moments of available light, so we're really going to need that dynamic range, especially pulling those details out from the shadows.
I think it's just quite symbolic, you know, as the day ends, that it sort of suits the lyrics and it suits the piece of music.
So we're going to be shooting 4K, 10-bit, DCI. It's just nice to see a bit more than a standard 16:9 aspect ratio. And the C70's autofocus is going to be really useful for the gimbal shot. The C70 has the ability to timecode sync. Being able to timecode sync all the cameras is going to save us a lot of time in the edit. The camera shoots 120 frames at 4K and 180 frames cropped at 2K, which is super slow. It's so cool watching the strings vibrate. The camera has an RF mount, so we're using RF lenses. They're really compact and also really fast, which is amazing. There's an EF adapter you can use if you have EF lenses, and there's a new one coming that will speed boost the sensor so it looks full frame. The C70 also has a vertical filming mode. Canon Log 2 and Canon Log 3 are in a multitude of their other cameras, so I can easily match the C70 with the C300 Mark III or the C500 Mark II. I've absolutely enjoyed shooting with the C70. I think people are going to be super impressed with this camera. It's going to inspire me, I think, to shoot more off the cuff, shoot more candidly, and I can produce beautiful images straight out of the camera.
Look at that. Learning Ecamm Live. Yeah, I unmuted you guys when we were watching the movie, but apparently we have to do it for every single scene. So awesome stuff. Well done,
nice job,
Dave.
Dave. That was really great.
Yeah,
Really enjoyed
cool.
Thanks, guys. I think
Yeah.
first thing I just want to quickly dive in and say is just a huge thank you to Kate, who was the DOP, and to James, who's a really good mate of mine, and he was the colorist. He also filmed most of that behind the scenes as well. And then Kim Churchill, who's the musician. I mean, that went from nothing to a finished video in about a week, and it was only possible because Kim was just such a lovely guy and totally wanted to make something, you know, beautiful and was really on board. So it's one of those things where absolutely couldn't have done it without every single person who was involved. So like, just wanted to make sure that they, you know, get a big thank you.
So when was this shot? How long ago did you do this production?
I think we finished shooting it about 2 weeks ago, and then we kind of burned straight into editing. There's two components that we kind of made for Canon. I guess the first one is the performance video, and then the second one is that behind the scenes clip. And they're both really important. You know, the performance video only works if, you know, for Canon, if you have a behind the scenes that shows what you did. And then the behind the scenes only works if the performance video is actually something worth filming.
Right.
And it's an interesting thing. We had a bit of a debate about making what the performance video would be, because often with these camera launches, I find sometimes the video that gets made has to show off every feature of the camera, and therefore the video itself stops becoming something that stands on its own. You know, if you watch the video knowing it's for a camera test, then you go, oh, okay, now I understand why we did this and this. But we kind of wanted to make sure what we made stood on its own. And Canon Australia was really helpful with that. Basically, it wasn't going to be an opportunity for us to use every single feature in the video. We weren't going to be able to put the camera on its side and do it vertically. We weren't necessarily going to want to use the internal image stabilizers on the camera because we kind of wanted that sort of rough handheld look. And we were quite lucky that they were sort of open to that idea, that we wanted to make something that would, be a piece of beautiful art on its own, and then show how the behind the scenes would support that. So, we still have debate about it because we used diffusion. We did all these sorts of things that you might not do in a camera test, but our hope is that years from now, that video for Kim, will still be on his website and stand up, even if you didn't know the C70 existed. So that was kind of the decision-making process there. In terms of the filming of it, we basically shot it, what you see on screen, in about 30 minutes, because we waited. The whole concept was, if we've got DGO, which is this new technology in the C300 Mark III, and now in the C70, which is dual gain output, that's the thing that gives you this 16 plus stops of dynamic range. And in our testing, we found that you really notice that in the form of clean shadows. So previously, where you would have a shot where, you've got sort of a low light situation, you'd be used to seeing quite a lot of noise in those shadows, but we found that they're super clean. So we thought, what's a way that we can shoot that will sort of take advantage of that? And deciding to film in that moment just after the sun sets, but before it goes fully dark, we thought that's maybe a good time to try and shoot a video. So it meant we had not very long, and that's why multi-camera coverage was really important. And multi-camera coverage is something that's quite easy with this camera because it has a time code in, and that makes syncing everything up quite easy. So that's kind of where the concept came from. And then, we shot it, we sort of prepped and got ready and rehearsed, and then we shot it in a 30, 45 minute window. And then suddenly it was dark. We had to pack everything up. So it was one of the quickest shoots that I've ever been on.
Hey, Dave,
cool.
the camera has a really interesting body. It looks sort of like a C100 kind of crash into a 1DX, and it's a crazy looking body. But I would imagine that holding that, it looks a little easier to hold than like a DSLR, because it's a little bit fatter and might be kind of like better to hold. Talk to us a little bit about what it was like shooting handheld, because you were saying that you did want to have that look, that handheld look. Did it hinder you in a way, or did you feel like the body design was actually a good one for that purpose, for handheld?
Yeah, I'm someone who, because I'm 6'6", I've actually found it really hard as I've been shooting a lot to find a way to comfortably shoulder mount a camera, because otherwise I end up looking down on people's heads. So for me, I've always been someone to come up with weird rigs that allow me to effectively handhold a camera like you would a Red or the C100, those sorts of cameras that were kind of designed to be used out here. So in seeing this body and the way that it's built, and sort of getting the idea that they're really intending for people to use the camera like this, personally, I thought that's actually really exciting, because there is something nice about handheld coverage, and it really does open you up to make decisions about what your shots are going to be, because you're not kind of fixed up here with, the camera moving with the top half of your body. You've got a little bit more flexibility. It's got a good heft to it. It's got a good amount of weight. I find when using especially a small mirrorless camera, unless you've got the internal IBIS turned on, that kind of handheld shake you get just from the camera being so small and light, that to me is something that even from the 5D Mark II days, I really hated. So I think the fact the camera is slightly larger than a super small mirrorless is a good thing, because I think that gives you that little bit of extra stability and weight that, you're still going to have handheld shake, but it's not that kind of vibration. But it's interesting. We can see that the hand grip, it's not an articulating hand grip, so the camera really is designed to be used like that. But it's quite comfortable. And you can see in the video that once we made that decision to sort of go handheld for most of the clip, it was just a really natural way for everybody to use the camera. It wasn't, trying to figure out a new way to kind of operate.
And you shoot with the C300 Mark III as well, so you're familiar with the weight in hand that way. as well. Did you find it easier to use than, say, the C300 Mark III as far as handheld goes? I do think people are going to be using this camera a lot in that sort of like run and gun mode, putting it on stabilizers. So that's why I'm kind of picking your brain about the whole handheld thing here.
Totally. One good way to think of it is I work on a show at the moment that we're shooting it on two C500 Mark IIs. It's a Netflix series. And, you know, the fact that we're delivering to Netflix means there are certain requirements around what kind of cameras you need to use. In previous seasons of that show, I had been on the A camera, which was usually the bigger camera. And then the director who's doing B camera would be on a smaller camera, you know, an A7S III or an FS5 or something like that. So for this series, now we're both using C500 Mark IIs because you can strip that camera down to be quite small. Where I see this camera being amazing is that director can now use something like this and still have that, you know, 10-bit DCI 4K C-Log2 footage. But unlike me, he's not weighed down with transmitters and receivers and, you know, all the big things that you kind of need for a documentary camera. He can run around with a nice prime lens on this and get beautiful shots that are going to cut in perfectly with my A camera, but he can be light and flexible and small with it. So I think that thinking about those two cameras working together and what you'll get out of one versus the other is kind of a good way to think about where this can be really useful. So yeah, I love using the C300 Mark III. You know, it's certainly made for that kind of shoulder-mounted, large lens style of shooting. But if that's not necessarily something you need, you want to be small, low profile, you know, get stuff that looks $1 million, but without having all the things hanging off it. I mean, this is a great pick. I think for a lot of documentary filmmaking, this is going to be a really useful camera.
And it matches
the
color-wise pretty
C70.
well?
Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
So the very nature, I guess, of the design of the C70 is it's not really intended to be a shoulder-mounted camera. I think even if you wanted to try and make it a shoulder-mounted camera, you'd end up with a giant Frankenstein rig. And because you don't have a removable or articulating hand grip, which most C300 or C500 users would use in a handheld situation, because you don't have that, it's going to be very limiting in terms of if you wanted to try and shoulder mount that camera. So I think you hit the nail on the head there, Dave, is it's a specific sort of camera that's targeted at a specific audience, I think, who's going to shoot very stripped down in a very sort of, documentary style way without needing to put lots of things on there. And I think the way that it fits in with the rest of the Canon EOS Cinema cameras in that lineup is really going to work well, because as you said, you know, you can give it to someone who can go off and get a bunch of little, you know, shots that can be inserted in there without them needing to use a giant sized, camera. So I think it's a camera, I think, that doesn't have any real boundaries. It could be used by anyone for any sort of purpose, I think, and that's probably the sort of the beauty about it. It's just what you want to do with that actual sort of camera, and having the ability to be able to cut in with more expensive cameras, you know, makes it a good option. I think this is a much better solution for a B or C camera if you're a C300 Mark III or C500 Mark II owner than, say, an R5 or an R6. It just makes a lot more sense if video is the application that you need to use your camera for.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And color-wise, I'm sure it's going to match, right? So.
Yeah, well, actually, this is a really interesting thing. Not to take a step back and go too big picture, but like I've been using the Canon cameras since, you know, like the C100 Mark I days. And when the C500 Mark II was announced, I remembered you guys doing this great write-up on sort of the history of those cameras. And you know, it made me go, oh, wow, I've been shooting on these things for ages. But one thing that's interesting is that I think traditionally they've kind of made the cameras standalone is the best way to think of it. Maybe it's felt like they develop a camera, they put it out, and then they're sort of on to the next one. And sometimes, you know, like the C200 and the C300 Mark II, those are cameras that should play really well together. But actually, I found it quite hard sometimes because the C200 has C-Log3 Rec 709, which is actually a bit different to using C-Log3 Cine Gamut or C-Log2 Cine Gamut on the C300. So your first thought is, oh, these are good A and B cameras, or I should get a couple of these and they'll work together. But actually, in reality, sometimes that was quite tricky. And I think looking at the C500 Mark II, the C300 Mark III, and now the C70, I think a couple of years ago, Canon must have taken a big step back and gone, let's stop doing these cameras in isolation. Let's think about this as an ecosystem. And the the C500 Mark II being the first one out of the gate there, even the body design matching the C300 Mark III, they're obviously thinking about how all these things play together, because not everyone's going to be buying one camera. They're going to be buying a camera and then renting two others, or they'll have this as the body that they own, but when the budget's right, they may want to use a C300 Mark III as well. And you can't, cram everything into this one camera and then move on to the next. I think it's great they've actually looked at things like C-Log 2 and gone, let's make sure that this is the same across all these cameras. Because from our testing, C-Log 2 Cine Gamut, which is the picture profile that seems to have the best dynamic range, and I quite like the look of it, on this, it looks the same as the C300 Mark III. And on the C300 Mark III, it looks pretty much the same as the C500 Mark II. So it's kind of nice that if this is your first step into a Canon, ecosystem, that okay, when it does come time to use other cameras, that's going to translate up.
Good stuff.
So for being a group of people, 4 up, that have all used these cameras at least in some form or another since they started coming out, even if some of it's just testing or on a shoot here and there, did you find that with the C70 that the fact that we sort of historically had a grip unit or a grip that can rotate did work against you? I mean, because we have to talk about the pluses and the minuses here, and that is one big difference, that you have a fixed body design. It's like a unibody. It's obviously interchangeable lens, unlike the XC15 and the 20, but you can't take that grip and you cannot rotate it when you're using it. How did that feel? Did you find that was a limitation for you at all, being somebody who's been using the camera since the C100 Mark I?
No, it's a good point. I guess on the C100 Mark Is, it wasn't an easy rotating grip. And actually, I've got on my C500, sorry, I just think it might be worth showing. On my C500, I've got these little, I think wooden camera make them. It's probably hard to see. Let me try and get it there. It's a little rosette that twists, so I can push my thumb on it, and then that will rotate the hand grip. But that's a third-party accessory. So that can just go like that. Because otherwise, they were sort of permanently fixed rosettes anyway. So I found that if I was shooting, it would be really unlikely that in the middle of a shot, I was going to adjust my hand grip, because you kind of had to unscrew, twist, and screw back in. So practically, using this, to get the shots, because it's so light, I think your wrist kind of does a lot of that rotating anyway. It's not a thing that I missed. There are things about this camera that we should probably talk about that are going to make it different to a C300 Mark III. But I think that a rotating hand grip, it just didn't necessarily feel like something that, I would be worried about, if that makes sense. Especially because the LCD articulates. So in a way, it's kind of like you can get the positions that you need quite easily between those two. I mean, I don't know if we want to talk about it now, but there are some things in this that I think separate it from
let's do it.
Cameras.
I think so.
A big one, I mean, the biggest one to me is the lack of internal RAW or external RAW. So Canon, maybe different to Sony or different to Panasonic, have made the decision to go internal RAW instead of having an external RAW workflow. And the C300 and the C500 have internal RAW. RAW is great, but I'll be honest with you, I don't use it that much. 2 reasons. One is the file sizes it's RAW, it's big. And the second one is that the internal intraframe codecs, the XFAVC codecs, from our testing, we've found that they're really solid. You're not necessarily seeing this huge performance increase by going RAW, that you might say, oh, well, now we have to shoot RAW because we need that high level quality. Actually, for this Netflix series and things like that, we are shooting 90% of it in the XFAVC codec because it's so good. But I think that that's a handy way for Canon to say, look, if you need RAW and that's something that suits your workflow, this isn't the camera for you. You should be looking at a C300 Mark III or a C500 Mark II. So that feels like a pretty clear delineation to me about what this camera can't do that those other cameras can. However, I don't think for a lot of people that's actually something that's going to be missed,
Yeah, inputs and
Matt,
outputs too,
yeah.
I guess, as well, because, with at a certain level of production, you need multiple outputs on your camera, right? You can't just have a single HDMI, A lot of high-end professional cameras will have multiple SDI outputs or monitor outputs, timecode, gen lock, maybe an HDMI as well. I think basically because of the size and the constraints that they had to work with, you're trying to put a lot in a very small camera body. By the time you pack in some mini XLRs and everything else, you don't have room to put those things in there. I mean, in some ways it maybe seem a little bit strange that they've been able to put a BNC timecode port in there, but then not be able to put an SDI port in there, and they've chosen to go with HDMI. Whether that's done on purpose to try and, I don't know, segregate the market there in terms of where you're going to put the cameras. There probably wasn't room to put SDI.
Is at work.
Yeah.
There may not have been room for SDI and HDMI full size in there. And if you put one in, you get, someone's going to complain that you didn't have it. If you put SDI in there and there was no HDMI, someone would complain that they didn't have HDMI out or whatever.
Sure.
If you put HDMI in there and you don't have SDI, someone's going to complain there's no SDI in there. So trying to put both in there might have been a challenge. I mean, maybe they could have put a full-size SDI or a mini. Remember those old mini-sized SDIs that they used to have on some of the Blackmagic recorders? Yep. Or they would have been forced to go with a very small, say, like micro-sized HDMI, which nobody wants to use. And as you were referring to before, Dave, I think the difference is here as well in terms of going back to the shooting styles compared to a larger camera like the C300 Mark III or C500 Mark II is because it doesn't have an EVF and you've only got that articulating screen and you're not going to probably shoulder rig this camera, is you're going to get a lot of that people shooting here from the chest, which in your case is fine because you're tall, right? It works, but a lot of times you see vision and you can tell basically what type of camera it was shot on by everything's looking up at somebody, right? Because everyone's holding it down here in front of their chest, which doesn't work unless you're 6'3", 6'5". If you're 5'3", you don't want to be shooting like this because everything's up the nose. So that's something to keep in mind with this camera because there's no EVF, so you can't actually put it up to your eye. You're going to have to shoot with it down here because holding it like this is probably not going to be the best option.
It'd be interesting because I wonder whether, given the articulating LCD screen can go flat to the back, I wonder whether, I used to have one for my 7D, that kind of loop system. You could get like a little Zacuto thing and you could whack it up to your eye like that. And it's essentially just a magnifying. I've always found shoulder mounting DSLRs is kind of counterintuitive because you end up taking this thing that was so small and light and then turning it into this kind of unwieldy thing. But it'll be really interesting to see what kind of third-party stuff comes out. Is it a mount that comes over the LCD here, or is it on the back? Or it'll be interesting.
I mean, there is a question in the chat for you, Dave, which is, I'd love to know how you particularly feel about having only the LCD and no EVF on this camera. Do you feel like, as a documentary filmmaker, that you're going to be compelled to go out and get a Zacuto or some other third-party brand EVF for this for sure, for certain types of shooting scenarios, or not?
It's interesting. Hey, like I've always, I got really used to having an EVF on my C200, but on the C500 Mark II, I actually use V-Locks on it a lot of the time, so I don't use the EVF. And certainly, I've got SDI ports and things for days. I could really easily put an EVF on there. But for the sort of shooting style that I have, I actually find putting a sun hood over the screen and having maybe a little bit more of that situational awareness that looking at a screen gives you suits the way that I work. I do find if you are using an EVF, it's totally situational dependent, but your world becomes what's in that shot. And for the kind of shooting I do, that means I'm going to walk into door frames. That means that I'm going to trip over something. That means on some series that, someone's going to come up behind me and smack me over the head or something. So I've actually always been a bit more of a fan of having a screen that I can look at, and then my world is still kind of around me a bit. But that's me, and I know that for a lot of people, an EVF is really important. And I could so see that, if it's the right kind of, for some people, not having one on this camera will be a downside. Especially if in a mirrorless camera, you can kind of put it up to your eye and use it that way.
Now I had the same problem sort of with the Blackmagic camera, the Pocket. When I was testing one out, it just was really hard for me to get used to not having that option, not having the ability to be able to look into a viewfinder. And it's pretty sunny here in San Diego. If I'm shooting outside, the LCD screen I know on that we're talking about a different camera, but that caused a lot of problems for me. I mean, I felt like I can't use this camera without an external EVF. I didn't trust what I was shooting, and then I got some soft images because I couldn't focus. Do you feel like the LCD screen, like I know you mentioned that, it does work pretty well. Is it bright enough? Is it brighter than what you got on the C300 Mark III, or are we looking at pretty much kind of like the same LCD screen?
I would be interested to see someone do some proper testing. To me, just sort of off the cuff, it felt about the same. The first thing I do with these screens is that I dial the luminance up as high as it goes. Not necessarily the brightness, because that does wash out your image. The luminance does just seem to give you extra nits. So on my C500, my luminance is as high as it goes. On this, it was jacked up. And at that point, they looked pretty similar. Now, if you're out in a bright sunny day, I do think using a hood of some kind is the way to go. But I found that using my waveform in conjunction with jacking up the luminance, it's pretty good. It's obviously something they've thought about. And I guess maybe from the DSLRs, they kind of know that you've got to get those LCD screens as bright as possible, because a lot of people are just going to be shooting in the sun with nothing but that screen. It's not as bad as it could be.
And you have scopes, right? There's at least a waveform monitor on there.
This is the other scopes today. So you've got waveform, you've got false color, you've got the false color edition. I think is incredible, because again, much like time code, it's one of those things they could say, "Oh, look, that's not what this section of the market's about." But I think they're really thinking about this working for, people who are coming from larger cameras or working, with cinema cameras. False color is a really big deal. And same with, I've lost my train of thought. There was a couple of the comments in here that are really interesting. I don't know whether we want to quickly fly through any of those.
I'm actually going to bring up a couple right now, or you can read them. Yeah, because we've got, did you only use RF lenses? Did you try the speed booster? Was that available? Or was it just RF lenses?
No, unfortunately, I would have loved to try the speed booster, but they didn't have one here in Australia yet, because that would have been awesome. But just RF lenses, and they were really fun. I haven't used the RF lenses before. The fact that you have that control ring on the front of the lens that you can map your ISO to, the extra stabilization.
Oh, so you can do that through the camera body of the C70 as well, like you can with the R series cameras?
Yeah, you can map the control ring, and I think that's a thing that's quite, it's different. I've got to think about the ways in which I would use that practically shooting, and just sort of, if you're someone who's coming from that R5 or mirrorless background, I wonder whether there's a bunch of shooters coming up who are used to now having that third way of controlling things.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I'm just looking through my menus.
And what RF lenses did you use? Do you know which ones you had on there, or?
Yeah, we used the RF 70 to 200, which is half the size of the EF 70 to 200, which is crazy.
Yeah.
That lens is amazing, and if you could get a RF 70 to 200 on a C500 Mark II or a C300 Mark III, that would be the dream, because that's a pretty incredible lens. The 15 to 35, which
Beautiful
is
lens.
a little bit wider than the 16 to 35.
Cool.
Great image stabilization. We used that for the gimbal shot at the start of the piece. And then because we wanted to be quite tight, but also wide, because I think that gives you a really nice feel for the close-ups, we were on a 35mm 1.8, I think, which again is an RF lens with an image stabilizer in the lens. We made a call not to use the internal body stabilization, even though that's a feature that they're really promoting for this camera, because we did want to, like I said, kind of have a lot of that handheldy movement. And one of the things that's interesting with the in-body stabilization is that, its goal is to smooth everything out. And we sort of felt like in this situation, that would kind of take away from what we were wanting to do. So using lens stabilization felt like that good middle ground in terms of being stable, but not being smooth, if that makes sense.
Right. So Matt, when you were writing the article, were there some things, as somebody who hasn't used the camera yet in production, that you were curious about or you wanted to know more about that you can ask Dave about? Like, you know,
we've pretty much,
trying to put you
Dave
on
and I
the
have been
spot, but
talking.
yeah.
Dave and I have been talking on and off for quite a while about this camera. So I think he gets sick of me asking him questions. You know,
I
late
love
at
this
night
stuff.
I'm
It's my favorite thing in the world.
sending him messages. Can you look into this menu? Does it do this? Does it do that? I mean, I think that the interesting things with this camera, obviously for the size, is that, you know, the built-in ND is huge for a camera that size, right? We haven't seen it being done before in a compact camera, so that's a big deal. And I think, you know, the ability to actually be able to record 4 channels of audio without having to use any type of XLR module is also something that shouldn't be overlooked in there. Now, the camera's got built-in stereo microphone as well in there for scratch audio. And so you can actually assign those to, say, channels 1 and 2, and then your mini XLRs to 3 and 4. But the camera also does have a 3.5mm stereo microphone input as well. So you can assign that to channel 1 and 2 and also have your XLRs. So that's pretty good for a small size camera like this, because this is the type of camera where you're probably going to use a basic little, you know, some type of Rode on-camera microphone that you'll put on the top so it doesn't take up a lot of space. You'll plug that into the 3.5mm jack, but then you've still got the ability to have 2 independent XLRs going there. So that's 3 channels of audio. I mean, you have a look at most of the other small size cameras that are on the market, and they don't have the ability to do that in terms of audio. So this camera is aimed at that sort of independent filmmaker, you know, documentarian who wants to, you know, needs to record audio is an important thing, and they're not always going to have a sound recordist with them. So the ability to be able to record multiple tracks of audio on board, as well as timecode sync, is a huge deal.
And that 10 stops of ND is another interesting thing. When we filmed a series a little while ago, the whole brief on it was wide open, like we're talking 1.2, 1.4 for the whole show. Outdoors didn't matter. And, you know, we were using FS7s, and it was really hard to be fully ND'd on the FS7 with a variable ND on the front of the lens, and then a speed booster adapter to have the full frame look and all this sort of stuff. And it's really changed my way of shooting, being able to use the C500, the C300, and now this with 10 stops of ND built in, because, you know, to be 50mm 1.2 and hit a button and your ND swings in is, yeah, it's fantastic. That's the kind of stuff where as soon as you don't have it, you go, shit, I got really used to this.
And you can activate that ND through the touchscreen interface, correct, as well on the camera?
Yeah, I should have. I'll see if I can do it here. Sorry, let me just jump out. What's interesting, we talked about it, Matt. I'll try and hold it up, and hopefully the tracking, it's on my face, but we'll see if I can convince it to, all right, this is going to be fun. There's a touch screen that you can kind of hit there, and that brings up a touch menu. And then in this menu, you get a whole lot of it still tracking to my face. There we go. In this menu, you have a whole lot of your main options. So your frame rates, resolution, C-log, all that kind of thing. But what I also really like is down in here, you've got some of your quick access stuff. So your white balance, ISO. But right here, you can hit one button and go 10 stops of ND just like that.
Wow.
Now, I'm used to my C500, which has, you know, quite large NDs that go zzz, and, you know, that's just the realities. The Alexa is the same. To be able to just go 10 stops of ND with one button click is just very handy.
Yeah,
here's a question
really
for you,
great.
Dave, based on the ND here is, can you assign that to any of the assignable buttons on the camera? Could you assign 10 stops of ND so you could just press it on a function button?
I'd be surprised, but I'll have a quick look for you. That's a great question.
Yeah, there's a lot of great questions coming in into the chat right now. One of the ones that I'm curious about is if you've ever used a C100 or C100 Mark II, you'll know that if you press in the joystick, you can get quick access to menu items. And they basically took that functionality out of almost every other
so
Canon Cinema EOS camera. And somebody had a question on whether or not that's a possibility. And I'm really curious about when you're changing frame rates. No, they didn't. Okay.
You've still got to hit the function button to bring up the selection reticule, and then you can navigate left and right with the thumbstick.
Got it. So
but
function
on the C100
activates
Mark II, you could
The
push in
best.
the thumbstick and it would activate it.
best.
And it was so good. And they just have taken
I
that
know.
away. Actually, I'm gonna make a note of that one because I feel like that's
Yeah.
got to be something you can put back in.
I will. So one of the things I did notice when you brought that up, though, Dave, is that I have never used a C300 Mark III, but I'm familiar with all of the other Cinema EOS cameras. These menus that you just showed us that we were looking at seem like an introduction of a new, and you can see it on the Newsshooter article as well, like a new way of being able to access lots of different things in the camera without digging through menus. Is that new to this camera, or is some of that in the C300 Mark III as well?
No, I think this is its debut, and it's interesting because it's such a small thing, and it goes along with ergonomics. But for me, the Canon menu system, part of it's just what I got used to, but I've always found it to be really intuitive. And when you're quickly changing settings on the fly, just knowing where things are is really important. So it's interesting to see them making changes to that setup, that you can turn on this touchscreen menu system and have these new options. It feels a lot like the Blackmagic menu systems, which I think are really great. And it's cool to see that Canon is probably saying this is a direction we're going to start going in. You can have your more in-depth menus with pages of stuff and very specific settings, but you have this quick access menu with the features you actually need in the middle of a shoot right then and there. And I think that's actually a really big deal, because I think, again, it shows that they've probably got one eye down the road and are trying to think of what where things are headed.
Hey, I got a quick question for you about the frame rates and how did you find that at 4K 120 with no crop, which is amazing, first off, for that camera. I think that's great that we're having 422 10-bit. What about that 2K 180 crop? I know, right? It's like it's crazy that we're now actually getting all that. And that little camera, that was one of the things I would have thought that Canon would have held back a little bit, but they didn't do it. They gave us 422 10-bit. So how does that look to you? Did you find it comparable to, say, 60 or 23
We didn't
or
spend
24?
that much time at the 180 frame. The 120 looks fantastic, no question. 120 4K is just, there's two shots of it in the BTS clip. Again, one of those things that I wish we could have had something that would have been purely slow-mo and been the whole clip, but we only could include a few shots. The 180 frames, we didn't spend much time using. My assumption, based off everything else, is it's probably pretty similar to what's in the C300 Mark III. And we actually found that was better than you would expect. On the C200, the 100 frames per second, I never used it. I didn't think it was good enough. I would feel pretty comfortable using the 180 frames on this camera and on the C300 Mark III. You might need to, it's not going to be as sharp, but it's certainly usable. And for some of the stuff we were doing, which was a cooking video, when you're getting popcorn exploding at 180 frames per second, it's a pretty unique point of view that sort of outweighs a little bit of the drop in the quality.
And it's nice that it's 2K. I know it's not that much more than HD, but it's having a little extra resolution kind of tells you something, that they want to make it better, which is great. It's not a huge sacrifice there. So also
there's something
the
else
XLR
interesting there.
really
Also, you
great.
go. Yeah, well, mini XLR I've never actually used before, but all you need for a mini XLR to go to a normal XLR is an adapter or something like that, or you can just get the cables in there. But to mini XLR.
I think it's great because audio always seems to be that one thing that gets kind of kicked to the curb. We were talking about that earlier, right? It's like SDI or HDMI, you're not going to get both, but boy, audio always gets kicked to the curb when it comes to smaller cameras. I think it's really great to see 2 channels XLR. Even though it's mini, it doesn't really matter. It's just a connector, but it gives you that balanced audio.
And I think that's sort of their way of saying that if you want an A7S III, and there's some amazing things that camera does, but I think if you're in a certain kind of shoot, things like built-in NDs, things like XLR, like that sort of stuff really is time code. That's the stuff that really makes or breaks a documentary shoot. And I think that including those features is their way of saying, this is a video camera first and foremost, and we're not going to hold that stuff back because we want to protect a different product. If you want stills and video, you go the R5, but if you want video, this is going to be a good unit. There's something else in here I just saw that I thought might be worth mentioning. Someone asked if it's going to be Netflix approved. I reckon that's the headspace they've been in making the camera. The DCI 4K is the biggest indicator of that. Netflix really likes things that have DCI 4K, which is that slightly wider than 16:9 resolution. And the fact they've included it on this camera says to me, as well as obviously 10-bit and all those other things you need, that they're really gunning for that Netflix approval. And certainly, like I said, the show we're shooting at the moment is a Netflix series. And if we do another season of it, I fully expect I'll be on the C500 Mark II and the director will be on the C70. You know, that's
Interesting.
The perfect workflow.
I'm going to circle back to the audio thing, because one thing in the article on Newsshooter that Matt, you mentioned, was just the placement of the audio controls. So if you just want to explain to people who haven't read the article where there might be a wee bit of a gotcha there when it comes to that. Matt, when we're talking about, because when we're looking at the back of that, they're behind the screen. And so so when you want to make adjustments to your audio, I know, Matt, you had mentioned in the article that they're right behind the screen. So if you make the screen flat with the camera body and it's not out, then you don't have access to those. So, I mean, I just think that's important that we understand where we won't call them gotchas, but the pluses and the minuses of making a camera body this small are. There's always going to be some sort of compromise. The question of, does that BNC port become an SDI out, or does it become a timecode port? We only have one other camera that I'm aware of, maybe I'm totally wrong, that's really in that $7,500 less price point. Maybe there's more than one now, but when the EVA 1 came out, that was a big differentiating factor to that camera, and now we see that in the C70 for multicam. So, I mean, I just think you have to be aware of that. The other thing was, we're seeing some comments about Adobe Premiere Pro and how well does the codec work. We have a more advanced camera here in terms of sensor and capabilities, but this codec is tried and true. If we go all the way back to the C300 Mark II, that 410 megabits per second, UHD 4K codec is not going to be a problem in a relatively new system when you're dealing with it. It's not hard to work with this codec in a timeline. And there's variations of it, of course, but I think people need to understand that as well. Do you gentlemen have any other? Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Because I think it's kind of important to also bring up is that, a lot of box cameras like the Z-Cams and the new Komodo and most of Red's offerings, they don't have any audio, the Red cameras don't have audio. You got to buy a module, right? But they don't have audio controls on the camera at all. And on the Z-Cam, that's always been kind of a stickler for me, because I got to go into the menu to change the audio. So if it comes down to, look, just give me the controls on the body. I'm cool with opening up the flap to get to it. It's a whole lot easier to change audio that way than it is to dig inside of a menu to do it. And that's the same thing with the Blackmagic, pocket camera. You got to get into the menu and do things. And so, there's only so much real estate on these bodies. And boy, I'm sure the engineers are always like, where am I going to put this? And are they going to hate it here? And if I don't put it here, are they going to hate it more if it's not on the body? So I appreciate that it does have at least the controls, physical controls.
And thinking of gotchas as well, like, I think another thing that's interesting is that they've made the decision with this one to use SD cards. And as someone who's now quite heavily invested in CF Express, because that's what the C500 and the C300 uses, I'm a little bit bummed that you've got to use SD cards in this camera. However, I think for people who this is their first Canon series camera or cinema series camera, SD cards are a much more affordable way into being able to record 120 frames per second 4K. They're not the cheapest SD cards in the world. They've got to be high speed. But I just thought that was interesting, that if you're looking at it as an ecosystem, this camera uses different media than the C300 Mark III and the C500. So that's probably worth mentioning as well.
Hey, quick question about using it on a gimbal. I know this camera is going to be very popular. If you're a handheld gimbal operator, how small of a gimbal do you think you can get that on? I know there's more gimbals in the market now than there are cars. So, different types of cars. Are you able to use it on, say, like a handheld, crane, Zion crane, or smaller Ronins, or anything like that? Or do you really? Because it looks like in that picture right there. Yeah.
The Ronin S is pretty small compared to the Crane S3. I think this was probably It's interesting because I found it a little bit awkward to balance on the Ronin S, and what it made me think is it's probably really well suited to the. Actually, it all depends on the lens, obviously, but if you want to use the 15 to 35, I found that this is probably just at the limit in terms of the weight distribution of what's going to work on the stock standard Ronin S. I think the Crane S3 you'd probably have no issues, but I think the Ronin S2, that we assume is being announced next month, I feel like it'd probably be a great fit for that. But I think what's important, I mean, I can get my C500 Mark II to fly on my Ronin S. It all depends on what lens you put on the front. So if you have some kind of small pancake prime lens with some stabilization in it and stuff, that could be a great pick for the gimbal. You just got to be aware if you're going with those larger zoom lenses that weight distribution and how it all sits is going to be important. But yeah, it feels like, and for our clip, we knew handheld was going to be a huge part of it, but we also knew we do have to put gimbal stuff in there because this is definitely a huge way that people are going to be using this camera.
So my job is to be a timekeeper, especially when people have call times, and it has been amazing to have Dave on the show and to give us his hands-on insight into this camera, the relationship between this camera and other cameras on the market, especially other cinema EOS cameras in the ecosystem. But you are literally, you have cameras built and you are walking out the door in less than 10 minutes to go on a shoot. So it's my job
I've actually, if you want to, I'm really happy to. I need to walk out the door at 10:45. I'm happy to do a quick fly through of some of those comments and just do a speed round of quick answers if that's something you want to do.
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, so do you want me to just fire them to you and you can kind of give quick answers, or what's the best way to do this?
Sure.
The three of us can. I mean, and now that the gents have access, they can throw them out too. Dave, how long did the BP 30 or the 60s last in the camera? Is it good battery life or does it suckish?
It's incredible. 400 minutes out of a BPA 60, which is nuts. And I think what that shows is that the image processes. I know, it's fucking crazy. BPA 30, you're looking at like 150 minutes. So the most battery life I've ever seen in a Canon camera out of a BPA 60. And I think that just sort of shows that the power draw on this is really light. That's a huge benefit of this camera is battery life. I've never seen anything like that.
Does it's AF important to note too that there's no AC input on that camera, so you can't attach it up to mains power, so you have to run it off batteries. I'll just put that out.
Yep.
Really? Look, coming in at the end with the big surprise, Matt Allard, almost like you had it in your pocket to just throw out there. Ridiculous.
Well, you could probably get like an adapter for it. Someone's going to make an adapter that's a dummy battery.
Dummy battery probably.
Yeah.
It'll happen.
There's some already for the BP. There's already dummy batteries for the BP series. But really, if you had a 30 and then you bought a 60, it seems like that's a pretty much all day long for most shooters, right? You don't feel like you need to buy two 60s and a 30, do you, Dave, for this camera?
No, I've just put a BPA 60 in. Let's see. Let's see. Oh, touching the wrong screen. What do we got?
Come on.
You're going to get it.
There it is.
414 minutes. There you go.
Ridiculous.
The BPA 60, fresh off the charge.
Very nice.
Okay.
Got it. You can never have too much. That's for sure when it comes to power.
Does autofocus work at 120 frames per second? Yes. I don't think it's face detection, but it is autofocus. And it's also worth noting that for the first time, now when you record 120 frames per second, it gives you an audio track. I haven't used it. I don't quite know what that means, but the idea being that you can probably sync via audio if you're getting some kind of sound level through. That's very handy.
Okay. It did seem like from the article that when you go to 120, there's a variation of the codec that's not exactly the same as when you're shooting at lower frame rates. But you've already said that the quality of the image that you were getting at 4K 120 was really good. I would guess that's attributed to this new sensor.
It's long GOP and intraframe. Basically, the idea is the long GOP is more compressed. Your file sizes are going to be smaller. It is a lesser codec or a lesser compression, but I've found from my personal usage that it's really comparable. The thing you want to be careful of, though, is that a long GOP codec, 10-bit or otherwise, is going to be hard work on your editing system, harder work than shooting intraframe. So a good way to do it is if you bought this camera, shoot a bunch of stuff in all the different long GOPs, intraframes, whatever, and if file size versus picture quality wise, you're not seeing the benefit of intraframe, shoot long GOP. Especially the market this camera is aimed at, long GOP would be really great for corporates or, music festivals or that kind of stuff. It's not, everything's going to be a Netflix series where you have to have intraframe.
Yeah, going back to the media just quickly with the SD cards, because you've got the dual SD cards, there's a lot of options Canon's thrown in there for recording. So you can record different resolutions onto two different cards, and you can also record long GOP to one, all I to the other. And there's also, I think, a mode where you can record progressive, and then you can also record UHD progressive, and then you can also record an HD interlaced version at the exact same time. So there's a lot of good options on there.
Well, remember that list that you have for Canon, Dave? The next question for them is, can we shoot off-speed 60 and 24 to two different cards so that we don't have to shoot clean and we can do off-speed at the same time? Just throwing it at... I mean, look, we might as well... I mean, if you can record to two cards at the same time, maybe there's some... I'm going crazy here. Somebody planted that seed in my mind. He's from the Ukraine, I'm just saying.
It's not a unicorn, Jem. It's not a unicorn.
You talk to Slavic about that, okay? And you see what Slavic says. He just, I don't know what's going on with that Ukrainian wine, but, it happens sometimes.
Fergus in the chat says, does it happen automatically if you go from 24 to 120 in 4K? Will the codec change match? No, you have to change codec first. So if you want to shoot high speed, you might be able to map different things to be quick access, but I found you've got to go select long GOP 4K, and then in your slow and fast, you can go up to 120 frames. But if you try and go to 120 frames when you're selected intra frame, you will only be able to go up to 25 on the 4K. And someone also said, does it have interval recording? Actually, don't know. I'll have to have a look. I know that on the C300 Mark III, they got rid of interval recording, I think. And there was a bit of people being, fair enough, upset that was gone. I'll check, but I imagine if it's not on the C300 Mark III, it's probably not on this as well, is my guess.
Can I want to clarify something, if you can, and I know you didn't shoot anamorphic, but maybe this is a question for somebody else. Maybe, Matt, you got some insight. There is some sort of anamorphic feature on the camera, but what is the purpose of the features there? Is it a true, C500 Mark II? Or what is the intention of what they have in the camera? Do you have any insight into that?
It's just a couple of de-squeeze viewing options that you can actually put up in the camera, also send out over HDMI. So, I guess if you were shooting in a higher resolution, you could probably still throw an anamorphic lens on there and then dumb the resolution down. I mean, it's like, I guess it gives you the ability to shoot anamorphic, but not proper anamorphic. So I don't know why you'd probably want to do that. But I guess there's a fad for anamorphic at the moment. So yeah, I mean, a little strange. I don't expect there'd ever be anamorphic modes in a camera like that at that price point. It just sort of doesn't make sense because I don't think does the C300 Mark III have any anamorphic modes, Dave? I can't remember.
It does, yeah. Same deal though. It's all about your sensor size, I guess. And if you're shooting, Super 35, and you are going to lose resolution by going anamorphic.
So it makes sense, of course, for the C500 Mark II. Would it make sense for the C300 Mark III and the C70 if you were going to record in 2K, in DCI 2K, or not? Would that be an application potentially? Question. I'm not saying we have the answer here. I'm just throwing it out there of when there might be a practical application if you could make it make sense if you were using an anamorphic lens. Because there is a Super 16 mode on here, but there's also a 2K recording mode. I don't know. I don't know what the answer to that is, but this is why we do this. We make our little minds think about things.
Yeah, I would love to chat with someone who's really across anamorphic, de-squeezing, and your sensor heights and what you're getting 1.3, 1.5, 2 times, just to see how all that makes sense with this camera. For me, I'm not quite there with that stuff yet, so not sure.
A 1.3 times or a 1.8 times anamorphic lens would work on any 16:9 sensor. You just obviously lose that resolution, but it's better than 2 times, obviously, because you're not throwing away as much information. But 1.8 times and 1.3 times are designed to be able to work on traditional 16:9 sensors. So I guess in theory, yes, you could do it.
You know, one thing that does sort of surprise me is Canon. They don't have an app that you can use on on a smartphone. Like, I really like being able to do that. I think this camera would have been a great opportunity to sort of get into that. But Canon doesn't. Do they even have that with their EOS R cameras? I don't know if they use an app for camera control.
Yeah, on my R, which is what I'm using as the webcam, you can open an app and take photos with it and import files. On the C200, you could open a web browser and control the camera that way. But I think more for the C5, the C3, and I assume this, I have to check, but they're now sort of saying if you want to do Wi-Fi controlling, there's a separate dongle that you use. I'm with you. I think being able to have sort of an internal remote for it would be great, especially if you're doing a multicam event of some sort and you've got 6 of these cameras. It could be really great to put one somewhere weird and then trigger the recording, remotely.
There is a couple of ways of doing that. You can open a Canon web browser, and you can actually get an image up there and do control of that particular camera. And it's also compatible with a Canon remote control unit that you could use in a multicam environment. But that's like a $2,500 or $2,700 that remote control. So I can't see many people using that. But yeah, I agree with you too, Eric. It would be good to see some sort of app-based program where it doesn't necessarily need to show you a picture, but that you could actually make basic parameter changes to the camera, change your white balance, the NDs obviously because they're electronic, bring up peaking or something like that, change frame rates on your phone. Again, that would be very handy considering the size of the camera. If you have it mounted up high somewhere on a crane or whatever, being able to make changes or even be able to do, touch focus possibly, would be a big deal, I think, with a camera that size.
Yeah.
Yeah,
no,
I'd like to jump
in.
in.
Type
yeah,
C.
go ahead.
I'm just curious about the USB Type C. Is that, you think potentially can you use any kind of external media with that, like an SSD drive or something similar to what you're seeing on Blackmagic cameras, or is that just more for just data, kind of like updates and such?
I don't believe so. I believe that's for like doing things like FTP transfer and stuff like that. You can use the USB-C out, and I guess I think you can use that too for webcam.
Okay.
So if you wanted to take it straight out of the side of the camera and plug it in, you got a webcam.
Matt, I might just have to jump in. There's a DC in port on the camera.
Oh, there is?
Down in the back here next to the battery. So I think you can put external
I was completely wrong.
Into it. Yeah, you're right.
It's so small you can't even see it. Okay, there it is. Okay.
There you go.
I will say one other thing, that I would be shocked if, based on the history of Cinema EOS cameras, if you can't go into one of the menus in the camera and create an ad hoc Wi-Fi network and do a browser-based through your smartphone or a tablet or a laptop control of the camera. There is latency problems a little bit when you do that, but you do in fact through that, and it's just some, if I could remember it from all the videos I've done, it's like 192.66. blah 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 blah, and you connect to that default, and what will happen is you'll get on that default IP address a full user interface. It's actually like 2 pages, and you can do white balance, you can change ISO, you can generally change aperture. So I think, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that there's probably some functionality that lets you do that. It's not going to be as polished as you're going to get with, let's say, Panasonic's ecosystem, but I think there is going to be some way you can get that camera into a remote location and you can still have an ad hoc Wi-Fi network to have some camera control. Now it is
a bunch of stuff on the article.
Yeah.
On our article, there's a bunch of stuff about all that type of connectivity that I've written in there. I mean, I added it last night, so I can't remember off the top of my head exactly how everything works. But yeah, go to the article and you can find out more about that.
Awesome. So now it is 4 minutes before the time that you have to leave, Dave. Thank you for doing the speed round. If you're going to buy the camera, honestly, I don't get excited about cameras very much anymore, but I think that Canon has done something pretty interesting with this camera. I mean, if you really look at it, dollars and cents wise, you can get two C70s for close to the price of a single C300 Mark III. And they are very different cameras in certain ways. But if you're a certain type of shooter and you're doing certain types of work, I think that this camera fits into a lot of things. And the fact that we have wide gamuts and we have Canon log, 1, 2, and 3, and we have high data rates and all of the little things that we would expect to have in a higher end cinema camera. You have to look at what the downsides of this camera are, and where the ports are placed and the expandability of the camera. But I think they've done something pretty interesting overall. Any last words, gentlemen, at all? Let's hear it, and then let's take this out.
First off, Dave, thank you so much for joining us this week, because I think it was great. Your information was invaluable, and like the price of the camera at $5,500 is a little high, but we'll see. But again, Dave, thank you so much. Great to have you.
Oh, guys, it's honestly my favorite thing in the world to talk about. So I'm really excited to have. My partner also says thank you for giving me this outlet, because she is pretty sick of hearing about this stuff. So yeah, big fan for a long time, and thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it. And if anyone wants to follow up, there's a couple of I'll be on the Newsshooter article discussion comments that you guys have there. I love talking about it. So just hit me up, and I'm happy to answer what questions I can.
That's great. Thank you very much. Everybody continue the discussion on the article, the forum on the Newsshooter website. There's a Patreon. You can go check that out. Some exciting stuff going on with that. And we'll see you next week, episode 5. I don't know what it's going to be about. Eric and Matt will decide, and I'll just kind of help move things along. Everybody, we'll see you next week. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and check out the Newsshooter website. Until next time. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Thanks, guys. And thanks everyone.
Take care. Bye.